Hey friends, in today's video, I'm sharing 2 recipes that will help you get by when money is tight. To start out with, I'll be trying to make the least expensive but most delicious chili possible. Then later, I'm super excited to be trying a new Italian dish. But first, let's get started with the chili. This time, I'm making a ground turkey chili. I used to make this for my family quite frequently, and it's a favorite. Not only is turkey a healthy option, but it's also much less expensive than ground beef. It's almost always on sale, and this brand is my family's favorite. But Walmart also has a brand that's cheaper, and that's a great option for lots of different kinds of recipes. But you can also use ground chicken here if that's what's on sale. Of course, sub in some ground beef instead if you'd rather. Over the years, I've used canned beans for this, and I've sometimes used dry beans, but today, since we're trying to keep the budget as low as possible, I'm using dried beans, and I'm using 3/4 cup of beans of each of the pinto beans and also of the dark red kidney beans. I checked, and pinto beans are currently running 83 cents a pound at Sam's Club. So we're probably only using about 30 to 40 cents of pinto beans here, and a little more on the dark red kidney beans. If you want, you can just omit the kidney beans and use pinto beans, but I do actually really enjoy what the kidney beans add to the chili. They hold their body very well, and they just make it very visually interesting. I'm using an onion. I can get these super cheap where I'm at, but if they're not cheap where you live, then just go ahead and use onion powder. That'll be just fine. I think the last brown onion I purchased on sale was 17 cents, so I'll be using about a cup of diced chopped onions. I usually like to add some tomatoes of some kind. My favorite is the petite diced tomatoes. However, my son doesn't like chunks of tomatoes, so I sometimes use crushed tomatoes for him. In order to trim the budget, I'm just using one of these cans of tomato sauce, and I think it's gonna achieve what I want, and it's gonna keep the budget lower. And then you've just got your usual spices: chili powder, garlic, cumin, oregano. Obviously, if you're missing oregano, it's not going to make a huge deal. Same thing with the bay leaves. I've got them, so I'm going to go ahead and use them. I sometimes use the liquid chicken broth here, but this time I'm going to be using bouillon just to cut costs, and it's going to be just fine. And I'm also only going to be using half of this ground turkey, so this is about $1.50 worth. My goal is to get this entire recipe down to just a few dollars, and I think we've accomplished that with these ingredients. And ground turkey has very little fat in it, so I am going to go ahead and add some oil here. It is currently 4 o'clock in the morning when I'm filming this. My idea was just to get this ready and throw it into the crock pot, and then it would be ready when I get home this evening after 6. If I was cooking this at home on the weekend, I wouldn't be adding the meat in at this time. I would add all of the other ingredients and then I would hold the meat back until the last 2 hours. But because I get home so late, I just don't have time to do that. So I'm going to throw it all in at once and then we'll see how it turns out. My crock pot doesn't get to boiling. And if it did, and I put it on high, that meat would be super dried out and super tough this evening. However, I think it's going to be fine because I'm going to be cooking this on low. But if you're cooking this at home and you have time, just go ahead and add everything in except the meat. So including the seasonings, and then just add the meat in at the very end. This is one of my favorite recipes if you want to feed your family meat, but you're trying to make it stretch, because a little does go a long way here. And another thing is I wasn't quite sure how much water to add in here because my family does normally like their chili to be a little more brothy. However, I was trying to make this a little less so this time, but at the same time, I didn't want it drying out while I was at work, especially since I'm going to be gone for 10 hours. So I'm adding a lot more water than I would if I were home and I was able to keep an eye on this. I added about 5.5 cups of water, and then I added a small amount of the chicken bouillon. I do know that I'm going to need to add more and definitely some more salt, but I'll do that later on when I get home. It's delicious. It is. That broth is so good. It does need a little bit more salt, and I'll add some more of the chicken bouillon. Perfect. I think I'm going to go ahead and remove a couple of cups of this broth. This would make an amazing gravy or broth for a soup. I am going to keep this and use it. If you want to, you can always thicken this. Like sometimes people use flour to thicken it. Some people use masa. I've even heard of people using refried beans or just mashing up half of the beans to make it thicker. But this is actually, I think, about the right consistency for what I want. And this is delicious. I would eat this just like this with a little bit of hot sauce. Here are some toppings that we normally like to have in our family. For this, I just fry up some tortilla strips and use some cheddar cheese, and my son likes sour cream on his. But for the tortilla strips, I just cut them up like this and then fry them in a pan. And this was a different chili that I made one time, and it's got a little more broth in it. You can see that's how we normally like ours. But I will say that also having more broth is great if you want to pour that over rice. So that's great for leftovers, or even a lot of people just like to have their chili that way with chili and rice. For this recipe, I got 4 full bowls plus this, which is about, I guess, a third of a bowl. And you can see that it does have quite a bit of meat still in each one. So I think that we did really well with the use of the ground turkey there. And we still have half of it left for another recipe. I have so been looking forward to making this next recipe. I saw an Italian nonna make this and I've been wanting to make it ever since. It's a pasta dish with green beans. I think I've told you guys before, but I love to watch videos of grandmas that cook in different cultures because everybody knows that grandmas are the best cooks. And I'm using Barilla spaghetti. This does happen to be my very favorite brand of spaghetti. It always turns out perfectly, but you can use any kind you want. And in the video, the grandma used some fresh green beans. I don't have any fresh green beans. However, I do have these canned beans. So I'm just going to go ahead and use these. and we'll see how they turn out. She used a can of whole tomatoes and then crushed them up with her hands. I have these petite diced tomatoes, but I'm just cooking for myself today, so I thought I would just use this Roma tomato that needs to be used up. If that's not enough, I'll add in this Kumato tomato that I have. And then I'll be using 2 or 3 cloves of garlic. Had I picked up the fresh green beans at my local market, I probably could have gotten enough for this recipe for about 15 cents. And I'm also going to be adding in 2 small potatoes, which I know sounds very unusual, but I'm going to go ahead and try it. And so for this, I went ahead and washed the potatoes, and I'm cutting them up into bite-sized pieces. And for this, I'm using one of my saucepans because I wanted a shallow basin to cook these in. I'm adding salt to the water, and I'm going to start by boiling the potatoes, but this will be a little bit tricky because I want my potatoes to be finished about the same time that spaghetti is done. And potatoes take between 10 and 15 minutes, and my Barilla spaghetti takes between 10 and 11 minutes. So I'm just going to add the potatoes first and let them cook for a couple minutes, and then I'll add in the spaghetti. If I were using fresh green beans, I would have added those to the pot first, and then I would have added the potatoes. But I'm going to go ahead and test this water just to make sure it's salty enough to my liking. You want it to taste obviously fairly salty. Not all of the salt that you're going to add into this is going to go into the food. So don't be afraid that you're going to have, too much salt, but you do want to have your items to be perfectly seasoned when they come out of the pan. And in a separate, smaller saucepan, I am going to make another mixture, and I've got 2 cloves of garlic chopped up there. And then I just have this one Roma, and I thought I would see how much I can get out of this. And I actually think that I'm not going to need that extra tomato. This was a fairly large Roma, so I think that this is going to be plenty. I'm always amazed at the meals you can make with a Roma tomato. They're inexpensive and they're just so versatile. And this one's so beautiful. It's nice and ripe, and I think it's going to be full of flavor. Like I said earlier, it's just me. I'm making for, so I think this one tomato will be fine. I like to measure out my spaghetti. According to the box, a serving size is 2 ounces, but I usually eat 3 ounces. And I'm generally strongly opposed to breaking my spaghetti noodles, but in this case, I do think it makes sense because you don't want to have too long of strands. You kind of want the size to match the other ingredients. And for this, I'm using about half the can of the green beans. And I am going to tell you in advance that this was a delicious recipe, and I'm so glad because now I have another recipe to use canned green beans for. Canned green beans are not something that I get excited about. I mean, I like them, but I don't love them. So it was really, really nice to have a recipe that I could incorporate those into. And then I also added in a large clove of garlic. Probably should have added that into this water in the beginning. And that is just an add-on from me. I don't know if you guys remember when I made that big pot of potatoes and greens. That was an Italian recipe that I got from one of my friends that was Italian. And that is just so simple and so good, but it's simply flavored by salt and a clove of garlic. But I usually add like a pan of potatoes and some kind of greens, either kale or collard greens. Here I've got spinach and then the garlic, and it's just so good. And many of you actually tried that recipe and liked it as well. It's amazing all the deliciousness that you can make with just a clove of garlic and some salt. So for this mixture, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out a few of the tomatoes and just blend those up so we get a little bit of the tomato sauce in with the tomatoes. And then I'm just adding in some of the pasta water because that does have the starch in there. And then I'll let that simmer while I'm blending this in the blender. This smells so delicious. And the idea is that as soon as the other items are ready, we're going to add them to this pan. And this needs about a minute longer. And then I'm going to give this a taste, and I realize it does need some more salt. So I'm starting with just a small amount. And then I'll retaste this and adjust it again if necessary. But otherwise, the flavor is delicious. I love using fresh tomatoes. It is so bright and full of flavor. And the spaghetti noodles are ready, and I think I timed this almost perfectly. I think I would maybe do the potatoes about a minute less, but they're not falling apart, so I think this is actually going to work out just fine. This looks so delicious to me. This is definitely my kind of meal. So for the first bite, I wanted to try the spaghetti with a green bean because I really wasn't sure how I was going to like green beans in my spaghetti, but it turned out to be delicious. The flavor on this, it's seasoned perfectly. It's subtle, but you've got those notes of garlic, and then the little bit of tomato is just really sets the whole thing off. Now I'm going to try it with the potato, which is another item I wasn't sure I would like. But again, the potatoes have that garlicky note. It's just delicious. This all works together in this dish. I would never have thought to put potatoes with spaghetti, but you know what? I love this dish because first of all, a lot of these items are items that you might already have in your pantry, especially if you use canned tomatoes. And then the green beans, you could even use canned potatoes. I think fresh potatoes work best because you're able to infuse them with the garlic while they're cooking, but you might be able to play around with it and make the canned potatoes work. I ate every last bit of this, and I already can't wait to make this dish again. And I actually like this recipe so much that I made it again yesterday. This time I used that Kamado tomato that I had, and I added some olives to it. And I also tried this with a little bit of Parmesan on top, and it was delicious. So you can dress this up as much as you want to. But I do love this recipe with just those few simple ingredients. And I am out of time, but I do want to take a second to thank all of my very generous supporters. I just can't tell you how much your support means to me. Thanks so much, friends, and I hope you have a great week. I'll see you Sunday.
Morning has broken, my windows are open. Wanna feel the wind blow through my hair. Which way do I follow? What happens tomorrow? I turn to you and hope you can guide the way. Sometimes I give up, just wanna be on my own. So